After the Third Reich was overthrown, Allied armies took control of its previous holdings. On Soviet occupation area, a soldier from the United States was given instructions to search for a Russian general. This Soviet leader, who was described as a renegade Cossack, differentiated apart from his peers. Under the command of the German army, this person oversaw a group of Russian defectors. Years later, the Yankee discovered that the individual he was searching for was shortly handed out to the Soviet authorities along with his subordinates and was swiftly shot for treason. This is the story of one of the buried pages of the Soviet Union. It is the tale of a general who turned from hero to villain and recruited a group POWs to create the Russian Liberation Army. For the majority, they are nothing more than a band of traitors to the motherland, and for others, enemies of Stalin and Bolshevism. But perhaps it is the reality that they were just survivors seeking better conditions in captivity. Here I present to you the extraordinary life of Andrey Vlasov, who was originally a general in the Red Army, and later captured during the fight to lift the siege of Leningrad. Later, the Nazis placed him in command of an artificial army. This was a propaganda ploy intended to lower Soviet morale and encourage desertions. Vlasov became a highly decorated commander in the Red Army. He survived the purges of the 1930s and was put into action during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union on June 4th, 1941. By December of that year, already as a major general, he was ordered to report to Stalin and meet the dictator in person in a bunker beneath the Kremlin. Vlasov, as the first commander of the 20th Army, defended Moscow. He led quick counterattacks with absolute force against the Germans, stopping them and allowing General Winter more time to act. The miraculous arrival of those reinforcements from Siberia helped push an enemy at Moscow's gates. This victory made Vlasov the first Soviet general to defeat German invaders in a major battle. Stalin personally decorated Vlasov as a hero of the Soviet Union and personally awarded him the Order of the Red Banner, as well as promoted him to lieutenant general. Vlasov was soon appointed the head of the Second Shock Army. He commandeered thousands and thousands of men to break the siege of Leningrad. In the spring of the year 42, he saw how his forces crumbled. His sector was ravaged by a German counterattack and surrounded in a skillful maneuver. That front line fell into Axis hands. The general was offered a chance to escape using a plane, but he refused to abandon his men. In a humble farm is where he was precisely captured by the enemy. As a high-ranking prisoner of war, Vlasov was transferred to Berlin. His time in captivity also gave the general more time to reflect on the Red Army High Command's failure to reinforce its Leningrad offensive. He remembered all those thousands of men who lost their lives. Since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, he simply created an idea of what he must do so that Stalin does not destroy his country. Moreover, he said, the Bolsheviks did not keep their promises and thus denied the people the most basic justice. As of December, he issued an open letter condemning the Moscow regime. There he expressed his opposition to Stalin and the entire communist system. In his call to action, he said that Bolshevism is the enemy of the Russian people that brought countless disasters to our country. Stand up and join the struggle for freedom, and may peace prevail with Germany, he exclaimed. During 1944, as the manpower of the Third Reich dwindled and everything grew bleaker, Vlasov requested Heinrich Himmler create a formation of Russian deserters. Nevertheless, Hitler considered the Russians and all Slavic peoples subhuman who did not deserve to live. Curiously, Albert Speer, who was Minister of Armaments and War Production, developed a grudging respect for the tenacity of the Russian soldier. To obtain Hitler's approval for the formation of such a unit, he constantly put it on the Führer's table. Soon, Vlasov prowled prison camps like a maniac in search of potential USSR traitors. One of the prisoners he approached was Ivan Filipovich Makarov. In 1942, he was taken prisoner near Stalingrad and sent to a concentration camp. Ivan wrote in his memoirs that we were visited by a tall man in a strange uniform who encouraged them to switch sides. The Russian Liberation Army promised food and arms and German victory over Russia. He made a dent in a lot of individuals that one day alone. This odd man was to be joined by 50 Soviet men. Nevertheless, they recruited 50 more individuals daily. However, Makarov repeatedly resisted the urge to sign up in this army that attacked his homeland. Surviving until the end of the war, what Makarov did not know at the time was that this strange character who had tried to recruit him was his former commander during the Leningrad offensive of 1942. While serving as head of such a command, this general was not a Bolshevik and later did not view himself as a traitor to Russia. Instead, he saw himself as a guide who wanted to free the people from the ruthless Stalin. He believed his only mission was to free his beloved country from a tyrant. The fact is that Vlasov spent more than a year recruiting prisoners of war in the vast network of camps in Germany. Some POWs were marked as spies, others as traitors from the moment they were imprisoned. Those Russian prisoners really had nothing to lose and little to live for. Most people simply dread returning home. Some POWs were labeled as spies, whereas others were dubbed traitors as soon as they became prisoner. With Germany's brutal imprisonment policies against the Soviets, it is not surprising that many signed up to serve in the ROA. I can tell you that 130,000 men out of some 5.7 million prisoners signed up to fight Stalin. Some were anti-communist, many were simply desperate to leave the German camps for better food or even a minimally acceptable service period. The first real battle of this unit, composed of former Soviet servicemen, was also the last. They faced a very powerful Red Army division near Prague in 1945. They were ultimately defeated by the enemy after being trampled on in every section. The Third Reich ended in real time for Vlasov's forces. In a cruel twist of destiny, the ROA committed one last act of cowardice by turning on the Germans, allowing the Red Army to win in the midst of chaos. However, the Soviets chose to exact retribution rather than commend the few remaining members of the Russian Liberation Army for rebelling against the Nazis and aiding in the seizure of Prague. General Vlasov's army was disorganized, which caused many of its members to disperse over the area. But a few days later, Germany submitted to the Soviet Union. In an effort to turn themselves into the Americans, the fugitives traveled south and west to avoid the Soviet forces. Despite his utmost attempts, Vlasov was unable to escape the Soviet Union's grasp after seeking shelter under American rule. He and 11 of his subordinates were hung in a prison courtyard for treason in August of 1946, after a trial for their actions. The ashes were mixed together and dumped once the bodies were transported to a burial in Moscow. About 10,000 purge victims during Stalin's regime are buried nearby in a mass grave. Remembered as a traitor, Vlasov saw his incredible military record erased by his Nazi collaboration. Instead of remaining prosperous as one of Moscow's defenders, Andrey let his arduous anti-communism distort his moral ethics. He believed that Stalin, not the German invaders, was the true nemesis of the Russian people. First of all, he insisted on using force against Stalin rather than his fellow citizens. He nevertheless has to confront the fact that he resorted to violence against his country. A few years ago, Vlasov re-emerged as a hero. Prague raised a statue in his name and that of the Russian Liberation Army. This is because of its role in liberating the city from German forces. Vlasov is one of those figures in history who we cannot have a consensus on. There are many opinions about his figure, and it would not be unreasonable to think that the day will come when he is seen as a hero by the Russians themselves. It is more circumstances than his actions that define the life of this general.